everybody. Welcome to Ancestry Roads. My name is Sandy. I'm very excited about today's guest because we're talking about the Hillbilly Highway. And the Hillbilly Highway is literally my family. My family have traveled it. I have some that were left behind, some that traveled it, and some that traveled and also went back. We've got an author to talk about it who has spent an exhaustive amount of time and energy and tons of resources. And this is the book. Max Fraser is here today with us with Hillbilly Highway, the Transappalachian Migration and Making of the White Middle Working Class. This is really a history of my family. I am so excited to talk to Max. But before we do that, let me go ahead and give you a little bit of information about Max as we go through. And here, this is a copy of the book, which I love. It also has the culture of the Hillbilly Highway and the Appalachians as we go along. So Max was educated at the University of Pennsylvania and also Yale University. His book is produced and published by Princeton University. He's a scholar of American labor, cultural, and political history. His research and teaching focus primarily on the working class life and social movements of the 20th century. And if you will help me welcome Max to the webcast. Hi, Max. Welcome.
Hi, Sandy. Thank you. Glad to be here. Excited to be here.
Thank you so much. I forgot to mention, I think you're also teaching at the University of Miami currently, right?
That's right. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Miami.
Now, how long did it take you to read this book? I read the conclusion already, so I kind of have an idea, but how long did it take you to write this book?
Well, so the book originated as my PhD dissertation. So I started working on it probably about a decade ago. I did a lot of the interviews, a lot of the oral histories that I conducted for it in 2014, 2015, 2016, around then, and a lot of the other research that I did in archives and historical collections around that time, and then took a lot of time to finish writing it and all that, and revising it and editing it, and it takes a long time to write a book. So about a decade.
So I really was attracted to this topic. This topic is one that I have personally researched pretty much all my life. I was the first one technically born outside of Appalachia in my extremely large generation, going back decades and decades back to when West Virginia wasn't a state even. I'm the first one, and that was because also my mother wanted me born in a hospital. So I should mention that as well. But I have family that did migrate. I have family that was left behind. And then oddly or interestingly, and I hope you help explain this, I have a lot of family that did migrate and said, and came back as well. So I think the best thing to do is, before we start digging in, let me go ahead and welcome a few of our groups. So we have some people from Ireland, from Germany. I see Portugal in there. We also have some Californians as well, and Alabama, Tennessee, and South side of Virginia. So and the Puget Sound. So we've got a good mix of people. And I'm going to guess that a lot of these people have some hillbillies in their life, I guess the way to say it. And Max is going to talk to us about that term in just a minute too. So I hope nobody's offended by that. So what is the Hillbilly Highway?
Well, it's a nickname which I encountered, I guess, first. Those of you who are country music fans, and Sandy referenced that I spent a lot of time talking about country music in the book, but first encountered as the name of a song off of the country musician Steve Earle's first album. I'm a big Steve Earle fan, and he has a song, Hillbilly Highway, all about this migration. And then a nickname that I encountered sort of in the field, you might say, as I was doing the research for this book. And what it describes is, as many people, and you, Sandy, know from very personal, familial experience, this very large migration of poor and working class white Southerners from the Appalachian South, and really the Upper South broadly, because it encompasses parts of the South that we don't really think of as Appalachian, into Western Tennessee and Kentucky and places like that, that moved over the course of the 20th century, largely in search of work, better jobs, better working opportunities, to the cities of the industrial Midwest. This was at its peak in the first half or so of the 20th century, when there were millions of factory jobs in the what's now the Rust Belt, the Midwestern Rust Belt, but back then was not rusty, right? It was
No,
the
it wasn't.
manufacturing center of the country, and a lot of white Southerners who had worked on the land in some ways as farmers, worked in mines and mills and things like that. But as those jobs dried up or disappeared, or because they wanted better paying jobs, moved north. And so the Hillbilly Highway is a nickname, I think you would call it, a colloquialism, a sort of tongue-in-cheek reference to that movement from the South to the North. And then also, as you alluded to, Sandy, and as I talk a lot about in my book, many people who moved back to the South or moved back and forth along that highway throughout these years between homes in the rural South and old homes in the rural South, and families that remained there, and new homes in the urban industrial Midwest.
And it's interesting because right before we went live, it might be a couple reasons why we were just a little bit late, because we were in this really engaging conversation.
Yeah.
That hit home with me too is Max mentioned that a lot of his research was also done in funeral homes. And I totally get that. And I know a lot of you watching today are genealogists. So it's kind of interesting to me because my family migrated, the ones that stayed outside of Appalachia, but they darn sure made sure they were buried back home.
Yeah.
And it was funny too, because when you were just speaking, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, he was one of the ones, my grandmother, that migrated. They were poor, they were hungry, they were starving, basically. My dad actually went and got them from West Virginia and moved them to Baltimore at first. They moved on since then. But they would always have this need and desire to go back. And it was, and I would go back with them as a child very often. And part of it was guilt, because they were succeeding and they were going back. And my grandfather was so proud of this big old Cadillac, and things, and he'd go back with it. And he was proud driving there. But on the way back, he would get a little depressed because he got a lot of heck for succeeding when others didn't make that migration. So do you find that those that were left behind, did they have regret in your research? Do you find that families were separated?
Well, it's a great question. I think part of what was so striking to me in my research, and what was a challenge to try to figure out how to write about and to think about historically, as a historian, trying to think about the sort of, both holding on to the individual family stories, but trying to make sense of them as part of the big picture of American history during these years, is just how complex the migration was. There was every possible kind of permutation, people going and never coming back, right? Saying, I'm getting out of that holler where there's nothing but poverty and stress, and I'm never looking back, right? And whole families who left and didn't look back. And then there were people who, and these are people who I did oral histories with, or in other ways tried to reading memoirs or other kinds of sources to get access to people's experiences, who spoke or wrote quite poignantly of feeling for all their time in the North that their hearts never left the South, and the places and people, families, communities that they had grown up in and remained attached to. And many came back frequently for reasons like your grandfather, to show off their success in I'm sure both to share their accomplishments with their family. Some came back because they didn't encounter that kind of success. They got laid off at the factory and were, found themselves in an hostile and unfamiliar city where they didn't have family and friends to rely on in a way that had been more familiar in their Appalachian upbringings.
And that's a community when you're home. That's such a community, a tight knit one. And then this reminds me of the book. And if you have a chance, there is a movie. out by Harriet Arno, Dollmaker. You
Yeah.
just explained that perfectly about how they felt like they were forced to leave because they were not getting ahead. They were almost sharecroppers in a way. Today we would call it renters, but they were like, it's such a drastic move.
Yeah.
Such a drastic move from community and from food and from language and all types of culture. And I have to say that, Max, in your book, you really do dig into that and
Yeah.
get into that where you feel it.
Well, thank you. I would hope that everybody who is tuning in will read my book, but more importantly, if they haven't, read Harriet Arno's book. The Dollmaker is a beautiful, beautiful novel from the early 50s about precisely this migration and a family, the Neville's family, that leaves Kentucky for Detroit during World War II. And more to the point of what you've been saying, the real feelings of ambivalence and regret and sadness and loss that come with the move for the main character, Gertie. It's an extraordinary book, much better than my book. But my book it gives you the facts. That's
well, I don't know. I mean, there's
a very masterpiece.
There is exhaustive research, but but you're one of the first that I have seen that really tackles this in all the ways that can be tackled together. Arno's book is fabulous. I will always praise her work. But you also give us the research part. And like I said, a lot of us are researchers. So we kind of get your stories that you're sharing from others and your research as well. I think before we get too much further, the term hillbilly. So, Dolly Parton has this famous phrase. Now, I will paraphrase. I probably will get it wrong. We can call ourselves hillbillies, but you can't. That's when you call us that, it's usually negative. And I don't mean you, Max. I mean outside the area of Appalachia. My brother, who was one of these that he calls himself hillbilly. He calls himself big city hillbilly. So he likes to think of himself as both. And it's a very important word to him. For those of you who watch my web series, you guys might know of a singer that I'm very familiar with, Denton King in West Virginia. And he calls himself a hillbilly, but he also has a song called West Virginians Are Coming Home that talks somewhat autobiographical about his move as well as they're coming home. So they don't have a problem calling themselves hillbilly. And you give this great discussion about the term in your book. So could I ask you to just kind of recap that?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, I should say I don't have connections to Appalachia personally or familially. And so I was mindful in deploying that term in the book about precisely what you were just saying. Dolly Parton's line and others who said versions of it about it being a term that, and of course, there are other kinds of sociological terms like that sort of originate as slurs of a race or class that take on a sort of dual meaning depending on who's saying it, whether you're one of us or you're not. And I recognize that is the truth about hillbilly in really profound ways. But on the one hand, I wanted to be true to the fact that this was a term that was in wide use throughout the region and among the people and the families that I was talking to for research. When I say the term, I mean hillbilly highway, and wanting to be able to be true to that, the descriptive truth of that term. And the word
is a hillbilly highway. There's no getting around that. That is the term. That is a phrase. That is the history.
Right. And I coined this other term, Transappalachian migration, to try to, explain, I think, to outsiders more than anything else what the hillbilly highway is, because they might not understand that if they haven't heard the term before. But that's right. Hillbilly highway is the term that's used. Hillbilly itself, I think what I try to make clear in the book is that, hillbilly meant different things to different people at different moments throughout the history of the 20th century along this migration. And that the meaning of the term, whether it was being used as a term of endearment or mutual recognition between migrants who found themselves in Detroit or Cincinnati or Muncie, Indiana, to say, I see you, you're one of me, we're not like these, our neighbors here, was one meaning of that term, the way it was used by the sources that I was looking at. And of course, it also poured out of the mouths of in a much more hostile way, out of the mouths of longer established urban residents who greeted Southern white migrants with a great deal of hostility because they were hillbillies, right? In all of the negative ways, and dismissive ways.
Picture, and when we bring the language and the culture, it's something that we grew up with, but they didn't. And I imagine other, had their issues as well. We know from doing a year's worth of coal mining series on my webcast, the Welsh had their problems as well as the Polish, came in, and the Italians as well. So I kind of think that it's interesting that we parse out Appalachia as the hillbillies. But they are almost a different, I don't want to call it a nation or nationality, but they are similar in a lot of their experiences they had. We did have some interesting comments I want to bring up really quick. And this one's, I love Eric. Eric is a professional genealogist as well. And are you sure you don't have any connections to Appalachia? Because we're a bunch of genealogists here and we can certainly find out.
Eric, I would be surprised. But if you can find it out, I should say I have connections to agrarian hill folk, but not in Appalachia. My family is mostly, I have Jewish and Catholic roots. Most of my Jewish roots trace to Eastern and Central Europe. And so a few generations back, that would be where my family is. But the Catholic roots come from dairy farmers in upstate New York in the Catskills. So kind of out of Appalachian New York in the southern tier out west. But my grandfather
just barely. You go into New York, so yeah.
That's right. But my grandfather, whose people came from Poland, grew up on a dairy farm in Hurleyville, New York, and so I spent a lot of time when I was young with my grandfather, hearing stories about that, and that his home and where he grew up, and so maybe that, in some ways,
is your connection to
steered me in the direction. It's not the immediate roots of this project, which I'm happy to talk about, but that's, I think, as close to Appalachia as I get. Maybe Eric will correct me.
And then we have another question from Eric, which is kind of leading into the final discussion of this highway, where it is, when it is. So does this parallel the Great Migration of African Americans that migrated out of the Deep South?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. I mean, precisely. And I think for those of us who are historians, professional historians as opposed to professional genealogists, but there's a vast literature. There's also a huge world of genealogical material and sources and writing about the Great Migration of Black Southerners. What's really been lacking in my field and in 20th century American history have been equivalent studies of this parallel migration of white Southerners, which is in movement at precisely the same time, really beginning around World War I, and continuing, growing in scale, and continuing through the end of the 1960s and beginning of the 1970s. And that's really when both migrations begin to slow down and reverse themselves in sort of overall terms. But there's, again, speaking about from the perspective of my field, there's reams, shelves of books and scholarship about the Black Great Migration, but there's been very little on this one. And so the challenge that I set myself in embarking on this project was to try to do for the Hillbilly Highway, the Transappalachian migration, what many great scholars of American history have done for the Great Migration, which is to, in recovering the stories of migrants, of this group of people whose lives were upended by movement during these years, explain how that shaped American history in really profound and enduring ways. And we've got a lot of great books that do that for the Black Great Migration. And I hope my book will be a first stab, really, not in any way definitive or comprehensive, but a first stab at doing something similar for this parallel and simultaneous migration out of the South of white Southerners.
White Southerners. And I want to thank Eric for that question, because it also gave us a chance to lead into the next question. For Matt. Could you share with us one or two case studies or stories that you found along the way of those that migrated? Just two of your favorites, or two you think that you want to share?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as I suggested before, there are so many different kinds of stories, and I tried in my book to capture little exemplary examples of all of the different kinds of migrations that people made. So one of the people I did an oral history with, a guy named Wesley Regan, grew up in Fentress County, Tennessee, a place that I spent a lot of time in, doing just one of the locations that I spent more time in, gathering stories of people. This is a county on the Upper Cumberland Plateau, sort of not too far from the border with Kentucky, about an hour and a half driving time east of Nashville. And Wesley grew up there, and sort of farm on a kind of family plot on in a kind of very rural part of the state. And when he was old enough, as many people from Fentress County did during the 1940s and 50s, when the little bit of other kind of mining work and sawmill work that had been in the county were really beginning to dry up. As soon as he was old enough to drive, he headed up north. And many people from Fentress County, one of the interesting things that maybe people like you, Sandy, who have family connections to this migration know, but which was one of the things that I spent a lot of time learning about and then trying to write about, is that people didn't just sort of randomly leave where they grew up and, throw a dart at the map and in terms of where they ended up. But they were often following in the footsteps of family members, community members, neighbors, friends who had gone before them. And what that produced was what sociologists often refer to as chain migrations between very particular locations on either end of a migration, whether that's a transoceanic migration or a trans-regional migration like this one. So if you grew up in Fentress County, Tennessee, the odds were overwhelmingly likely, you would take a bet, you could take a bet, I'd take a bet today, that you ended up in either Muncie, Indiana or Dayton, Ohio.
Those that's pretty amazing if you think about it, because somebody went first.
Right.
And then wrote back, life is great. I'm making money. I'm surviving. I'm not hungry, or I'm not working in the mines. The mine didn't close. A lot of these Appalachians too were working in company mines, company towns.
That's right.
We talked about those start to close down. So it's amazing what you say, that you can pinpoint. And this is really important for us as researchers. You can pinpoint, if you're from Fentress County, you probably went to one of those two locations because somebody did and somebody wrote home.
Yeah, I have a great quote from another woman I did an oral history with, who also grew up in that part of Tennessee, who said by the time she was growing up, this was again in the sort of post-war decades, 1950s, going to Muncie was just like going to the bathroom. Everybody did it. And she did, and her family did. It was, and it's not a huge distance, but it's 300 miles. And, there's a lot of other cities in the Midwest during this period of time where you could end up, right? Even in that little part, Muncie is in East Central Indiana. You're not far from Indianapolis, the big city, but Anderson, Kokomo, these are all Fort Worth, these were all big auto cities at the time, to say nothing of the really big Midwestern cities, Chicago, Detroit, Cincinnati, right? But if you were growing up in Fentress County, Tennessee, at that time, Libby Anderson said, growing up, going to Muncie was like going to the bathroom. Everybody.
That's just funny. And what's interesting to me with that comment also is when you say it's not too far of a distance, but culturally, it's between here and outer space.
Yeah.
It really is. When they took a chance, they did it. They went, and it is just amazing to me how many did. Now the map that I'm showing here just kind of talks a little bit about, I guess, a section. And this is kind of more for us that are researchers. This is really more central, north central, and northern Appalachia that you're seeing, and then starting to go over to the west. Now they also went much further than Indiana and Illinois, right? They would trek all the way to the Midwest and California as well.
Yes, that's right. They would. I can say a little bit about that, but I love this map. Can we go back to
let me
that?
go back.
This is great. It's one of the things that I discovered in my research. So if you could imagine this map without so these are all highway interstate routes, which is great to see. But if you could imagine the map, because one of the things that I discovered in my research, or I didn't discover it, but one of the things I write about in the book, because other people have discovered it prior to me or were able to begin to document it, is that part of what determined where people end up, part of what made those chain migrations, those connections of family, community, friends that people followed when they decided to leave where they grew up and move along the Hillbilly Highway, was where highways themselves had been had appeared on the terrain when they were first being constructed, built, and when the roads were being built in the throughout the region. Now, the blue lines on this map are interstates, and the interstates, of course, were not really constructed until the late 1950s, 60s, and later. So you have to imagine an earlier version of this same kind of map that was mostly made up with state highways of various kinds. And you can see some of those numbers underneath, like the white signs with highway signs sort of underneath the red lines with the white road signs on them on this map underneath the darker, bolder blue lines. But the highway system as it grew and expanded in the years after the 1920s really laid down the first connections between places in Appalachia and in the industrial Midwest that kind of became, you might think, the hydraulic system of this interregional migration. And when people left Jamestown, the county seat of Fentress County, to head for Muncie, they did so mainly because Route 127 initially was drafted in such a way that it connected those 2 points on the map. And so people followed the highways, you know what I mean, when they picked where to go. And so those connections, when they were originally forged, were often determined by where roads went and where roads didn't go, shaped where people didn't end up. It was easier to follow a road in one direction than that was where you got at the end of the day, and where your people got and stayed, and these whole generational networks and circuits built themselves. You would ask about California, though. I'm happy to say something about that.
Let me ask you real quick, though. This is something I'm going to throw at you, and I apologize for not discussing this in advance, but it's very fascinating how you say that the roads were kind of built, and that's how they traveled. So I'm going to assume, and I know your primary focus is also on labor. So I'm going to assume that along the highway or at the end of the highway, that's where businesses decided to do those big plants, because they took advantage of this knowledge that people would travel this mostly one road travel. I mean, you might have to get off one to another one, but I would assume that they were pretty, forward thinking, saying, hey, if we build this plant here, they will come.
Yeah. Well, I write about like a sort of academic study that was produced in the 1930s about migration during the Great Depression. And, there's a lot of people take to the road during those years because they're out of work. This is a national, obviously, crisis, a global crisis, but it's impacting communities all around the country. And so this big sort of government-supported academic study looks at migration during these years. And one of the points that it makes is that because of where highways have been built and not built, it's often more likely to see them. They're writing about Appalachian migration. You're more likely to see people taking the highway out of Appalachia to these Midwestern industrial centers than they are moving within Appalachia itself to some of the much smaller, but still by Appalachian standards, significant regional centers, Knoxville, Chattanooga, that are growing up, that are growing during these years within Appalachia. And that gets back, I think, or it's an indirect way of talking about what you were asking, Sandy. Much of what determined where the federal highway system was, where it went over the course of these years, was about bringing people, goods, delivery routes, things like that into the growing centers of American industry, which were not in Appalachia, right? Which were in the Midwest and in the Northeast. And so as a result of that hydraulic system that I'm referring to, that system of roads, which allowed people to move in and out of the region, more regularly brought them out of the region and into the Midwest, in part because there were factories there that needed them to go to work, and needed that labor and would need it in growing ways. The railroads also were very important, although in part because of the terrain of Appalachia, its mountainous terrain and things like that. And for other reasons, the railroads do probably less carrying people out of Southern Appalachia during the mid-20th century than they might in other parts of the country, and certainly out west.
And that might lead us into California as well. So to go 300 miles away is a lot. But to go to California and migrate out west, that is huge. Why did the Appalachian labor just move? Was it like as simple as the calling of the West, the ocean, or labor?
Some of that. I think largely labor is the drive. I would argue, as a labor historian, is the real driving force. The greatest years of, I think it might have been Susan or somebody else noted that migration out of the region has been happening since the 19th century, and that's absolutely right. There's earlier foundations or blueprints of these migrations that are being mapped out before the 20th century. But the peak years, the absolute largest years of migration out of the South, and this is true for both white and Black Southerners, is in the years around World War II and immediately afterwards. And during World War II and in its aftermath, places like Detroit and Philadelphia, New York City, Chicago to some extent, are of course major sites of defense production for the war, federally sponsored, ships, planes, guns, all the huge infrastructure of the war economy. But there's no place that becomes as central to that economy and remains that way to the industrial economy after the war as California. And so it's beginning in the 1940s that you see this major influx of people of all races, but especially poor Southerners, moving out west to work in the shipyards of, Oakland and Richmond, and then up the Pacific Northwest into Washington and Oregon and places like that, Portland, Seattle, down into San Diego, the whole West Coast. So those years are also the peak years of the Hillbilly Highway, right, of this particular migration of Southerners that I'm focused on. And although most people from the region went north. And when I say the region, what I mean, just to make clear how I define it in the book, I really mean the Mississippi River east. So again, not exactly how we typically define Appalachia, but broadly what you might call the kind of the Southeast, the Upper South, the sort of Appalachian South, broadly defined. By virtue of proximity, they move north. Some go west. That was without a doubt, and that's because the labor demand in California is so huge. And then there's this romance of going west that all Americans were party to and experienced and were drawn to in different ways. I would certainly say that by the 60s and 70s, as the industrial economy of the Midwest is slowing down and beginning to move into reverse, and the Sun Belt and the West Coast is booming still, that balance begins to shift, and you see Southerners of all kinds, white and black, who are still moving out of the region, increasingly more likely to move west to places like California, Arizona, things like that, just because there are still jobs there and growing numbers of jobs, at the same time that what we recognize today as the Rust Belt is beginning to emerge in the Midwest.
And also somebody went there, as you mentioned before.
Right. Yep.
A family neighbor, somebody went there and said, the sun is shining. It's beautiful. I had no snow. I had money in my pocket. I want to pause for just a second. You said something a few minutes ago that was absolutely brilliant, that I know all of us know, but I don't think I've ever really thought about it till you mentioned it. But I'll use my family as an example in West Virginia. They don't move. You have that land, you have that plot. It maybe came from family, or maybe you married and you bought it, or whatever it might be. You're not moving from one town to the other. Usually you're staying and you said it perfectly. They don't move. And when they're in their region, they moved completely outside their region for whatever reason, mostly jobs. This is mostly a labor discussion. And that's just really poignant to me, because I see it. I can still go to West Virginia today and visit aunts, uncles, great aunts, uncles. They never moved. They maybe refurbished their house. They maybe did a new porch, whatever it might be. They didn't move.
That's right. But the one caveat I would say, and this is what the first chapter of my book is about, which is sort of the chapter that sort of tries to describe the origins of this process. Again, Susan or somebody, I apologize if I'm forgetting the name, noted there's a migration out of the region that predates the beginning of the 20th century, but it really accelerates at that time. And the reason, yes, thank you, that quote, right. As early as the 1850s, people are moving out of the region in some numbers, but that migration really begins to accelerate in the 20th century. And the first chapter in the book tries to say why. And what I argue is that what you're describing, Sandy, of people being attached to the land, which and their plot of it, which had been true for a period of time, becomes there's a great crisis of that's about access to land during the first half of the 20th century. And it's because of the growing industrialization of the region, the increasing buying up of land that had been individually owned or even communally used in some way as wilderness, as farmland, as pasture land by sort of more agrarian local economies for generations, by larger industrial interests, coal companies, railroad companies, timbering, lumber companies.
And the coal and the timber usually were together. They go in as one company. Right. Just totally changed.
And so what happens is, over the course of the first half of the 20th century, there's less and less land for people. And you imagine, right, generations. Your grandfather had a plot of land and he had 5 kids, and he divided up that land between 5 of them. And then they had 5 kids each, and each pine, by the time you get some generations down, there isn't enough land, right, to go around. And it's because of the pressures on access to land and the inability for people to have access to enough to really sustain themselves in those traditional ways that people begin moving in the region. And that's part of what pushes people into the coal economy in Appalachia and elsewhere, right? Because the family homestead isn't enough to make a living anymore. And there's this new coal mine opening in Harlan or wherever it might be, and they're hiring and they're paying good cash wages. And so people go work there or on the TVA, project at a certain point in the Tennessee Valley or whatever it might be. And then increasingly leaving the region altogether. And so some families stay, right? And they hold on to whatever foothold of land that they can. And obviously that foothold is what keeps that connectedness to the region for many people who leave throughout the decades to come. But because of economic changes in the region that really begin at the turn of the 20th century and accelerate through the first half, there's less and less land to go around, and people increasingly need to leave to be able to support themselves.
Right. And I will say too, it's interesting. My parents left around 1959, 1960. It was opportunity. The town that they lived in was pretty much as you described. If you're on hills in Appalachia or if there's water and things like that, and there's only so much buildable land as well.
Yeah, right.
And then Eric has a really good question that kind of ties into this conversation as well. Do you think the timing of this migration was enabled mostly by the technology of the car, of the automobile?
I think that had a lot to do with it. I think, that the increasing availability of cars, because I think this was a migration that depended more so on cars, some say actually on buses. And one of the stories I tell in my book is about a bus company that was created, and it's just one example of this kind of thing in Western Kentucky around Paducah to bring riders. Really, I mean, it was a bus company to serve the Hillbilly Highway. It was very intentionally designed that way by a local entrepreneur who himself had left Paducah, named Pope Brooks, to go try to find. It was
brilliant. If you don't buy a book for any other reason, buy the book for that. Now, there's reasons to buy it, but I was so immersed in the Brooks transportation. It was brilliant. And I'd never heard of it before.
Yeah, so this is a guy, he tries to make a living up in Detroit. He goes up there just before the Great Depression. So there's, he just at the wrong time kind of, and the auto industry collapses, but he sort of recognizes very intuitively and sort of with great foresight that despite this temporary interruption in sort of the industrial demand, the demand of the industrial economy of the Midwest, people from Western Kentucky, Paducah, and that sort of Jackson Purchase area of the far west of Kentucky are going to continue leaving to go north to find jobs in auto plants for decades to come. And so he decides to sort of try to capture that market by starting a bus company. And he begins by getting a big station wagon, kind of extended station wagon, and charging people fares to drive them up to Detroit and a few other stops along the way in the sort of auto corridor of southeastern Michigan. And the business takes off. And by the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 40s, he begins to buy a fleet of real buses and competes for a time with the national bus lines, Greyhound and others, but really focusing on this. This is his ridership. It is white people going up to work in auto plants. He knows that, like, if you're from the farm country of Western Kentucky, odds are you're going to at some point go up north and try to find a job there. And not only that, as he says, right, you're going to come back because your family stays there. So you're going to come back on holidays, and you're going to come back when jobs dry up because of layoffs, and you need somewhere to weather the storm. So you go back to the family farm until they're hiring again at Chevrolet or whatever it is. And the Brooks bus line, that he names it for himself, becomes the sort of, for this one leg or one one chain in
Yeah.
this complex network of chain migrations connects Western Kentucky to Detroit for tens of thousands of bus riders every year throughout the duration of the migration. So
It was a brilliant idea. It was brilliant. And, I don't know if he guessed that there would be the migration back in the visits and stuff, but it was a brilliant idea. I want to pause just real quick and let everybody know that we've got about 15 minutes left of our webcast. So if you do have any questions for Max or any comments that you want to make or anything like that, we always welcome them on our webcast. So please definitely drop them in the chat and let us know. If we don't know the answer, we'll get it to you. But we love interacting with you guys. So please definitely do that. So in our time left, this has been kind of the interesting and fun part, but now we're going to have to get into some of the gritty stuff.
mm-hmm.
So as these hillbillies, these Appalachians left, no matter where they went and they left, they were migrants at this point, and some people probably considered them almost foreign. And I know we had a comment that was really interesting, I thought, from David earlier about how this migration's, not much different from the Europeans and other immigrants that follow family to America. And just like those immigrants from Europe, they had their own slurs, talked about them and things like that. And so we have something called hillbilly ghettos. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one thing that I was really struck by in my research, which was eye-opening to me as someone who had studied American history and studied, knew a lot about American history and of the 20th century, and had read a lot of books about the time period in different ways, was something that I hadn't seen a lot written about, but which the more I got into my sources, the more commonplace I discovered was that at this time when, especially in the immediate, in that period I was just referring to of the immediate aftermath of World War II, the migration was at its peak. That as more and more migrants were settling in these sort of major cities in the Midwest, and because they didn't have a lot of money to start off with, that's why they left, right? Because they weren't able to make a living or as much of a living as they wanted in Appalachia. They were moving for that reason. And because to be a migrant, a newcomer in a new place is often to be kind of on the margins of where you end up, to be insecure in one way or another. You have to find a place to live and a place to work, and you don't have family to fall back on. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them, at least initially, settled where many urban newcomers of all ethnicities and races and nationalities throughout American history have ended up, which is in poorer neighborhoods that other people who came before you and had the means to leave left, right? And have and for a period of time, as this migration was at its peak, urban residents, municipal officials, mayors and police department, school teachers, various people who sort of worked in the civil municipal bureaucracies of the places that people ended up in, Chicago and Cincinnati and Detroit and elsewhere, began talking about this major problem that they were confronting in the city, which was the emergence of what they referred to as hillbilly ghettos, these sort of clusters of impoverished and sort of culturally backwards, unassimilated.
We speak different. We bring a lot of kids usually.
Exactly.
Our food is not normal to a lot of people. So.
And people were very in touch with all of the ways in which these hillbillies and these hillbilly ghettos, and I'm using scare quotes because these are ways in which my book, you have to use the language because there's so much meaning and history tied up into what people are saying when they're talking about this population with this language. They see them as different, as foreigners, and they actually, in a really interesting, something that's really interesting to me, often, especially in the 50s and 60s, talk about these hillbilly ghettos in precisely the same terms And in the same conversations with the post-war ghettos that were more familiar with thinking about of poor urban Black populations, Puerto Rican, Mexican ghettos of various kinds, the things that the population groups that we more naturally associate or automatically associate with poor urban neighborhoods in the post-World War II period. Yet for a period of time, not only were those Black ghettos problems of entrenched poverty and cultural maladaption that urban bureaucrats and policymakers were trying to figure out how to fix. They talked about hillbilly neighborhoods in precisely the same ways. And what they were articulating there, I argue in the book, was this real deep class hostility towards.
That's what I was going to say. It starts almost before there was any negative action coming in.
Yeah, these were just
like we do now. We'll say a city or name of a town that you live in that you're familiar with, and you'll automatically think negative before you even know the people or the region.
Yeah, that's right. And for the city, the more established middle class urban residents who resented the hillbillies who were appearing in their mix and identified their neighborhoods as problematic hillbilly ghettos. It was really because all of those things that you were referring to, Sandy, the way they talk, the size of their family, the kinds of the ways they worship God, the churches they went to, their communal life, their recreational activities were all seen as lower class. They were understood to be markers of a kind of regionally defined and inflected class difference that was just not sort of urbane enough, was not sort of middle class enough, was not respectable enough, and was a kind of an extension of a kind of Southern, very understood to be in a kind of regional way, Southern low culture that these cities didn't want. They didn't want in the same ways that the same middle class urban leaders and officials really didn't want Black Southerners, right?
I was just going to say, we talk about your book mentions about the white working class, and there are, as I read the book, so much that goes along as well with the Black, and you get the same stereotypes. No shoes, you don't speak proper, you're not educated, you're poor.
Like to drink, to be sexually profligate, to engage in criminal activity, all these kinds of stereotypes.
And
right?
the two racial groups just are both lumped like this historically, a little bit to this day, but mostly historically. And it shows to me this hillbilly highway, they were leaving to escape, to become a new life, challenging in all the ways that any of us today would leave to pick up, to move to a different area, a different state. But they had this tremendous amount of stereotype with them. And then they move into a poorer section of town because it's cheap. Let's just be honest, it's cheap. And they label it hillbilly ghetto.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say, I think it was Eric or somebody else was talking about the connections with the European immigrants of an earlier period. And I think, David, and that's a great question. And I think part of why hillbilly ghettos stuck out the way they did in the 1950s and 60s was because many of those earlier ghettos made up of European immigrants, Jews, Italians, Irish, and others. By that period of time, they didn't exist as obviously. Those earlier European white ethnics had sort of acculturated, had been around long enough that they got better jobs in factories and enjoyed the benefits of union membership and other kinds of
social services that came in to shut down some of the disease-ridden ghettos that we know from the immigrants. Yeah.
And so by the post-war period, the ghetto as a place in American urban life was being newly racialized. It was increasingly becoming associated with Black and brown people. And that's what made the hillbilly ghetto so confusingly problematic because these were white people.
Yeah.
And yet something about their culture and their class position made them not like the white people of mid-century sort of abundant middle class American sort of the affluent society of the post-war period. And
well, it's funny.
they stuck out and were spoken of in these same ways, and why the lumping of poor white Southerners with poor Black Southerners and other poor people of color during this moment was such a common, in the moment, was so ubiquitous in a way that we don't actually think of it being historically. And I won't get into it here, but the book tries to argue there were real political consequences to that really shaped social policy in important ways because of that. Ultimately, that kind
where
of
we are today politically.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, if you want to know where we are today politically, I would highly recommend you get this book, and you'll see, because I did mention to Max that we weren't going to get into too much politics, because this is not what my show's about, mostly because it's just not my wheelhouse, to be honest with you. It's my expertise. But as we're talking to Max and also reading the book, part of the reason I created this webcast was to change the narrative of Appalachia because of the last presidential election in the United States. So that's why I mentioned Max. It's kind of hard not to talk about politics when we're here. But I will tell you, if you want to know, if anybody like up on your social media comes up and starts calling, well, those West Virginians this or those Appalachian hillbillies or something like that, when we're talking about politics, I highly, highly recommend you read the book, because it goes into all those details. And Max has got it completely right. That is why we're here right now with real life, talking about major elections in America. And this is why Appalachia also gets a bad name associated with that. So, I do apologize to those of you, because I can tell you, Max, if willing to come back, we will take a whole hour, and Max will help me understand this whole political mess. I hate to say it's a mess, but it is, that we're in right now. But that's why we're not going too deep into the political. But you're right, Max. It's that whole hillbilly ghettos and the whole the migration. It created a new working class, but also politics.
Yep. I see Susan has a question, which I'm happy to answer if you want me to, which if we have time for it, which is very quickly. And that's a great question. And this migration also doesn't quite, or sort of is simultaneous or parallel or contemporaneous with the so-called Dust Bowl migration, which, or you might to think of the equivalent sort of ambiguously slur-like term, the Okie migration, right? For those of you who know the Grapes of Wrath and that terminology, a kind of a term not radically different from hillbilly to refer to residents of Oklahoma and the Southern Plains. But Eric's answer here is exactly right. In other words, when I was saying before that the geography, the region that I'm focused on is the Mississippi River East primarily. People who left, white Southerners who left that part of the South, overwhelmingly moved north to the Midwest. Not all of them, some ended up in California, but overwhelmingly that's where they ended up. White Southerners who left the Southern Plains states, Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, places like that, and moved in response to the ecological catastrophe of the Dust Bowl, and then continued to move in some significant numbers because of the draw of defense employment on the West Coast. The so-called Okies overwhelmingly moved west. That was just that's just how the sort of directions of those migrations tended to reproduce them. Some of them ended up in Detroit, so in other words, it's not a total and completely segregated migration streams, but the Dust Bowl migration was mostly from the Southeast and Oklahoma, like Eric is saying, and moved west. And then I think, it's a longer conversation to have, maybe I won't get into, but there's really great work about the Dust Bowl migration, historical scholarship works by a man named James Gregory and another guy named 𝗪𝙪𝙧𝙣 These are really great books. James Gregory's book is called American Exodus. 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗪𝗀𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗙𝗀𝗙𝗀𝗙𝗀𝗙𝗀𝗙𝗀𝗙𝗀 they're in a sense models for the kind of history that I was telling, and they focus on the movement of the Okie migration from the southern plains to California, and there are real differences in terms of the places they end up and what California is and is becoming during these years, as compared to what the Midwest is becoming as a result of things like deindustrialization by the end of this period. So there are differences in terms of outcomes and things like that. But in terms of the time period, Susan's initial question is exactly right. That the Dust Bowl, the Black Great Migration, and the Hillbilly Highway are three strains of this massive migration out of the South during the first 2/3 of the 20th century, which was really profoundly influential in all parts of American society. And as my book tries to argue about Hillbilly Highway, about American politics and American culture and things like that too. So
now this is I've got two quick questions for you myself, or one question. So we moved as Appalachians to the Rust Belt.
Mhm.
The Rust Belt is not a good shape right now.
Yeah.
And I love that you're here so we can dig into the labor part of this. Are we finding that maybe some are moving back to Appalachia, or just moving in general to where maybe there's jobs or easier way of life?
Yeah,
Cheaper grocery, cheaper loaf of bread.
Yeah, this is a major difference, I would say, between the Hillbilly Highway and the sort of Dust Bowl migration, or really during the period after the Dust Bowl, the ongoing migration of folks from the Southern Plains to the West Coast, which is that the West Coast, the economy there continues to grow increasingly at the expense of the old industrial economy of the Midwest after the 1970s. Jobs are sort of moving from one part of the country to another, right? And that is a movement out of the Midwest and the Northeast and into the South, the Sun Belt and the Southwest and things like that. So, yeah, I think what travelers along the Hillbilly Highway are confronting by the beginning of the 1970s and certainly afterwards is that the places that they had left home for are seeing their own economies begin to decline.
Yeah.
And if you were lucky enough or able to, in moving to Detroit or Muncie or wherever you ended up, find a job and then, go to school and train for a different kind of work than what your mom and dad probably left home for, which was
coal miners,
right?
the growing of your own farm, your, cattle farm or dairy farm even.
And then even a second generation, right? If all those miners and farmers left the South to become assembly line workers in the North, factory workers, and if you were smart enough and forward thinking, smart enough, I take that word back. If you were forward thinking enough, if you were able to predict something, which it would have been very hard to predict at the time, which is that factory jobs were going to disappear. And if you went to school to become a nurse or a, whatever it might be, then maybe you would survive the economic decline that accompanied deindustrialization in the Midwest in a decent way. But if you didn't, if you inherited from your family that sense that the factory jobs are our way into the American middle class, then what you experienced by the 1980s and 90s was the disappearance of that way out of a kind of working class insecurity and even poverty and downward mobility. And so many people did leave or get stuck in similar kinds of not Appalachian poverty, but Rust Belt poverty in the place.
It's very interesting because it's very similar. You make a really great point that the connection is really just one generation mostly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It could even be that small, depending on when you're right. Like your parents leaving in the 50s and 60s by the time you were growing up, or certainly your kids, the places that they ended up would look very different than what
very different. Like you said, they might be stuck and there was no way to predict I don't think what happened. So it is surprising to me. If you guys have any more questions, now's the time. We're going to start to wrap it up a little bit. I do want to mention that in the book, there is such a large, beautiful, beautiful section of culture. And I know all of you watching today, one of the things that we focus on the webcast here is the culture. And big 𝗪𝗏 fan, a Baltimore guy that came, ended up in Nashville and back, but big 𝗪𝗏 fan. So it's mentioned that his Hillbilly Highway, if you got a moment after this webcast, feel free, bring it up on Spotify or YouTube. I can't do it because it's copyright, but definitely do it. And Bobby Bear's Detroit City as well. So I just, when you listen to 𝗪𝗏's song, make sure you bring up the lyrics as well, because it's just really poignant. I see this whole conversation in that song, and I love that you also mentioned it. The book is exhaustive in sources, resources. I mean, I have never read a book or seen a book that has that many resources that I can go back to. And some of them are very familiar, like we mentioned at the top there, 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 and Harriet Allknow. Some of them are very 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪, we've mentioned. So I really appreciate the thought process that you put into it. And since you mentioned that you also, are not what you consider an Appalachian, I agree with Eric. I don't know. You really have brought this topic to us in a way that is kind, that is thoughtful, and also very educational. And like you said, a hillbilly highway is called that. A hillbilly ghetto is called that. And I appreciate the sensitivity that you gave to that term as well.
Thank you, Sandy. I appreciate it. It means a lot to me, and it was a real pleasure to come and chat about it with you. I thank you for the invitation.
And I hope all of you can help me as well convince Max to come back. His book was just literally released this week. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I hope you had a nice launch. I hope you had a big party, and I hope you had time with your family, because as you mentioned in your book, it started kind of pre-kid.
That's right. My family has grown and grown since this. It's been a long time. So when I first started, I had no kids. Now I have two. They're old enough to appreciate the significance of this, my first book. And so it's been nice to celebrate with them this week and appreciate all that.
That's great. And I wish you much luck on it, because we also, in the year of 2023 here, we focused on coal mining in Appalachia. It's pretty deep, pretty, excuse the pun, dark subject as well. So next year we're lighting up a little bit, and we're going to be talking about culture, specifically music. So we have
music. That sounds good.
So we have invited Max back after his launch of his book to come back and talk to us specifically about the research he's done in this book with the culture and with the music. And I look forward to you coming back. And thanks so much for this. This was fantastic for me to hear your stories and your research from a labor perspective, in particularly because my family did travel this, and some went back, some stayed. And maybe we'll get you back too, and you can educate me on the politics of this book, because that is the one part I would love to know more about. It's just not my wheelhouse, guys. I'm sorry. I tried to turn off all the debates and all the news.
A lot. It can really, it's overwhelming. I understand that impulse. So, well, I'd really love to come back and chat with you more and your guests, or your audience. It was a lot of fun. So
that would be great. And thank you all as well for joining us. You had some really great questions. I don't think they stumped us. I think we got it all. And I want to thank Teresa too. She just bought the book.
Yeah, good.
And she's going to Virginia Hill Country. She's going to Appalachia. So there you go. Everybody, thank you so much, and have a great rest of the month. We are on hiatus. We're only doing live feeds, short live feeds during October as we do our Appalachia road trip. So I appreciate you viewing us live. If you're coming to us after the fact, Thanks for tuning us in. We've got a couple more videos you might like as well. Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Sandy.
Bye, guys.